I want to start by saying how awesome birth partners are. In the time that I've been teaching, I've had hundreds of birth stories, and I would say 99% of the time the birth partner has been really great and totally risen to the challenge. So whether that's the special person in your life, a mother, sister, friend, you can have a real big impact on how the birthing journey proceeds. You are the familiar face. From that very first contraction all the way through to the baby being born, you're there. And that's not usually the case for the health professional. So you are likely to have a different midwife in pregnancy as you are for the labour itself. Maybe if it's a long labour, you might even have a different midwife because of a shift change partway through. So to have a birth partner that is there and can see what is helping you the most, and just do those little things that make you more comfortable and give you lots of positive reassurance, make a really big difference. I'm going to talk about two different roles. So I've identified that there's the role of protector and there's the role of advocate. So by protector, I mean somebody who is focused on protecting your birth space. So while you're at home, making a really comfortable environment where you can relax as much as possible. And you can see in one of the earlier videos how to think about all your senses, how to position yourself, all those sorts of things will help. And protector, it might seem like a little bit of a sort of old-fashioned word. And it might be that you're somebody, a career woman maybe, and you're used to standing your ground, arguing your case. But it's a little bit different when you are in labour, because you want to be able to focus on what's happening to the body. It can get intense and you're wanting to put all your energy into focus on how to make yourself comfortable for each contraction. You want to be able to focus on the breathing so that you're taking the edge off the contractions. You don't want to be answering questions on this, that and the other, because that switches on the new brain, the neocortex, that you've learnt about in another video. So although usually you might be very capable of getting information and making decisions, this is not the time to be in that role. You want somebody else who can be doing that for you. That's not to say you won't have any input in decisions, not at all. But it's just that there's a lot of questions, say when you first arrive at hospital, where they're checking your address and asking, when did labour start? All those things, you don't need to answer those questions. You want to be focused. And if there is an intervention being suggested, then you can, as a birth partner, you can be collecting all the information, the risks, the benefits, if there are alternatives, get all that information together, and then at a good opportunity, you can present the information. So as much as you can, you're holding this beautiful safe space for the woman to labour in. In terms of being an advocate, it's really helpful that you will have prepared your birth preferences or your birth plan before, because that really means that you've spent time seeing what the options are. What information do you need to understand the statements that you might put into your birth plan? And this just means that you're on the same wavelength. You're going into the labour knowing roughly what the other is thinking and what you're hoping for. Of course, this may change. And so as an advocate, your role is really to collect this information so that you can feel informed, make an informed decision, give informed consent, and ultimately feel positive about the birth. Because it may be that there are some changes in what you were hoping for, but my experience is, after reading hundreds of birth stories, that if somebody has felt fully informed at each step and they know why it's happening and they feel comfortable with it, they feel positive at the end. When people don't feel positive, it's because they felt out of control. They didn't know what was happening, why it was happening, and that can set off a feeling of panic and not being listened to. So let's go through some of the things that you might consider, and this will be useful for during pregnancy as well. So it might be either you as the pregnant woman or the birth partner would be collecting information. But I would really suggest to you during the labour itself that as much as you can, the birth partner focuses on being the information collector. Let's start with thinking about policies and guidelines. A policy is a document that outlines the exact requirements in a given situation. So it's a route of practice a midwife must take unless the mother says otherwise. In contrast, a guideline is a recommendation. So a recommendation for best practice, so you don't necessarily have to follow it, and this means that they're followed differently from hospital to hospital and from midwife to midwife. So for example, if you have a midwife who's used to being in the midwife-led unit, where she sees a lot more natural births, active births, however you want to call it, compared to a midwife who tends to be working the delivery suite, who sees people with comorbidities and more complicated births, more medicalised births, they might approach a recommendation from a very different perspective. So this is worth bearing in mind. I think it helps to know this because it gives you a little bit of freedom in then feeling confident that you can ask for other information, like, well, is there another way of doing this? Do they do this the same in all hospitals? Let me give you an example. So where my sister lives in Devon, if you are booked to have a home birth at 37 weeks, you would, as standard, have another scan just to check the position that your baby is in, to make sure the baby's not breached, so head up instead of head down. In contrast, where I am in Berkshire, if you're planning a home birth, you wouldn't have another scan unless the midwife really thought that the baby was in another position and needed to check. So that's two different areas of the country where they approach things in different ways. What I want to stress to you is that being offered an intervention means that you've been offered a choice rather than a decision. There's the intervention, there's continue with what you're doing, there's always a choice. And sometimes it's just a case that you need a little bit of time for the new plan to sink in. So most of the time you have the opportunity to take 5 minutes and just let the information sink in, have a hug, just accept the change of plan. And that can make a big difference rather than feeling rushed into things. The other tip I would give you is when you arrive at the hospital, or if you're having a home birth, when the midwife arrives at your home, that you give your birth plan to them. This is more important at the hospital because in most home birth teams you will have met with the midwife that is actually going to be at your birth. But at the hospital, it just means that if there are a number of midwives available, they have the opportunity then to try and match you with a midwife that really likes the kind of birth that you're planning. So there might be a midwife who has actually done some hypnobirth training, or she really likes having that hands-off approach, just letting you get on with things until you signal that you want some support. It won't always be the case. It might be really busy and you get who's available. But having said that, if there's just something about the midwife, and this has happened maybe twice in all the couples that have sort of been through my classes, there's just been something about the midwife that has made it really difficult for labour. And in one case, they just put up with it and felt quite negative about the experience afterwards. In the other case, the birth partner decided that it was really derailing the birth process, and so he asked to speak to somebody, and they managed to swap the midwives around, and she got on much better with the second midwife. So that is an option. I think it's very rare that you would need to do that, but if it warranted it, that is a possibility. Something else I want to talk about is making decisions. When you are given information, sometimes it's presented as a relative risk. So for example, if your waters break, that means the amniotic sac, those membranes, if they break before labour starts, so before the contractions have started, you may be told that the risk of your baby getting an infection in that amniotic fluid doubles. And that doubles sounds very scary. So that's a relative risk. However, if you ask for the absolute risk, what are the numbers behind that? It turns out that the research says that it goes from a 0.5% risk to a 1% risk. And that's very different. It's still doubling. It still might not be a risk that you want to take, but that's very different from 50% going up to 100%. So do you see the importance of getting the numbers behind what they're telling you? If it's hard to take in, you could ask the midwife or the consultant to write down the information or even draw a picture. It's so crucial that you feel you can take in the information. If you're asking for those numbers rather than the relative risk and the midwife says, I don't know, then it's okay to say, well, could you find out, because that's really important to me. There would be a supervisor of midwives on duty, or perhaps a consultant who will actually know the numbers. I would suggest also looking at the aims.org.uk website. They have lots of great leaflets and books. One of them is called Am I Allowed? And it just talks about communication and informed consent and unpacks all of that. I always feel a bit dispirited when I get an email from somebody with their birth story who says, oh, well, I wasn't allowed to do this or that. I don't want any of you to feel that you weren't allowed. If things are explained and there's a good reason behind it, then the language will change. We discussed X and decided Y. There's also another great book that I would recommend if you're getting up to your due date. As we know, a due date is just a guess based on ultrasound scans, and you know that has its variation. Sometimes babies show bigger or smaller than they actually are in the womb. So if you're coming up to your due date, there's a book called Why Induction Matters. And it's a great little book. It's fair, it gives both sides of the stories, good stories about induction, more challenging stories, but it goes through the different steps that might be taken, what you might be offered, and it also gives you strategies. And one of them is just to say, can I have a bit more space in between each kind of intervention? Just to give a little bit longer to see if something is working before you go to the next step. So over the years I've been teaching, there have been lots of inductions that have been very positive, so it's not necessarily a negative thing to happen. I personally, what I've observed is the further away from a due date that an induction is, whether it's that you have to have it early for some reason, rather than being close to the due date, that's when they tend to be a little bit more difficult. It's like the body's not geared up yet. But as we know, due dates are a guesstimate, so that's not always an accurate guide to know what will happen. And lastly, I want to suggest using something called BRAINS. So this is a great acronym. B is for benefits, so you could ask, what is the benefit of what you're suggesting? R is for risks. What are the risks in this intervention? And with any kind of intervention, there can be a risk. So for example, a sweep, which is where the midwife puts some fingers between the cervix and the amniotic sac and just tries to get some of the right hormones going to start labour. Sometimes that can mean that the amniotic sac actually gets torn and then the waters have broken and we start having a ticking clock for this risk of infection. So even though there's no drugs involved, something like that does have a risk. So it's still something that you need to consider. A is for alternatives. What's the alternative to this? Is there a different kind of pain relief I could think about? With induction, is there a different way I could be induced? So for example, at my local hospital, they've introduced these water balloons for induction. So instead of using a drug, a synthetic hormone, they've just started using this water balloon, which is inserted, and then slowly the balloon is filled with water to stretch open the cervix, and that can just trigger the right natural hormones to get induction going. So there's often alternatives. Then I is for indication or intuition. So indication means clinical indication from that health professional's point of view or their clinical experience. What would they suggest? And then intuition is for your own intuition. Sometimes you might have been really sure that you want to take a particular route through your birth, but in the moment you just feel that something needs to happen. So that's not to be ignored, because over the last months you've really become attuned to the baby's movements, and I really believe there's a connection to that baby. N is for nothing. So what if we wait a while? And that might be 5 minutes, it might be half an hour, half a day, it depends what the situation is. But as I said previously, there's usually not an emergency. You have got time to just wait a little bit and see if you as an individual need a little bit longer for something to take effect, or just to let some news sink in. And then S is for smile, because none of this is about being confrontational. It's just about receiving the information you need so that you understand what's happening. So when the birth partner is asking these things, it's in a a nice way, with a smile, just explaining that to feel comfortable and to feel positive, you want this information. I want to finish this video with talking about 3 common interventions that you can know about and be sort of forewarned in your decision-making process. So the first one is induction, and often an artificial oxytocin hormone is used to try and start the contractions, and this might be through a pessary, which is inserted sort of into the vagina, or it might be a drip. And the problem with synthetic oxytocin is that it doesn't act in the same way as a natural hormone. So it affects the body and can start contractions, but it doesn't move up past the brain barrier and affect the brain in the same way as the natural hormone. So if you do go overdue, I would really suggest familiarising yourself with the information on websites like aim.org.uk or get the induction book that I mentioned earlier. There are also the NICE guidelines, which is the sort of national guidelines, and you can read about why they would induce you, what the recommended steps are. There are other ways of inducing, like the water balloon that I was talking about before, so you can also ask if there are alternatives. One of the things that the book suggests is just to give a little bit more space in between interventions. So if you have started on a pessary, giving maybe that a little bit more time than usual to see if it will work before you go on to the next stage could be an option. And I would suggest, if you are going down that route, is to start all your techniques as soon as that pessary or the drip is used. So if you're using the TENS machine, as soon as the pessary goes in, apply it, because it might be that the contractions start to build much more quickly than in a natural labour. You sometimes don't get the same amount of time to sort of gradually focus in on your breathing, etc. The other one I wanted to mention is the artificial rupture of membranes, or ARMS. So this is generally known as breaking waters. And the review of the literature actually stated that routine artificial rupture of membranes is not recommended for normally progressing labours or even prolonged labours. Sometimes it just happens as course of a sweep, but this is talking about where a midwife is doing it on purpose to try and speed up the labour. They might feel like there's a lot of amniotic fluid underneath the baby's head, and that's stopping the baby's head coming against the cervix and getting the right hormones releasing. So there's reasons why they might do it, but it's good to understand what the implications of it are. And first of all, I'd probably just try changing position. So you might have been in a comfortable position, one of the ones in the other video that talks about ones that are nice and upright and helping get your pelvis in the right position. But if it isn't having the desired effect, try a different position, or maybe try moving a little bit. And the other thing is to just check in with the environment that is around you. Does it still feel safe and relaxing? Actually, has maybe chatter started? So there's chitter chatter kind of distracting you, or have the lights gone on and you can turn it down? Can you reintroduce a nice smell, a smell of home that will help you relax? So all the things that we talk about in that video, creating a cocoon, see if you can use those, and that might just help the labour progress before induction is needed. And the last intervention I wanted to mention was vaginal examinations, or VE. I think a lot of women feel like these are just a standard part of giving birth and something that you need to do, but actually it is optional. The research shows that when you go to hospital, the first vaginal examination actually prevents further intervention down the line. So for example, say you've been doing all your hypnobirthing tracks and you're actually presenting as very calm for the stage of labour you're in. So perhaps you arrive at hospital and you're, looking quite chilled out, even though you're 8 centimetres dilated. If you say, no, I don't want a vaginal examination, she might think you're so chilled out that she actually sends you home, and either the baby arrives on the way home or in the bathroom or something. So I would recommend, if you feel it's the right thing to do, is to have that first vaginal examination. But then the research shows that further ones don't seem to actually give much information to help know when that baby will be born. It's quite standard that a midwife will want to check that you're fully dilated before pushing the baby, in case there's a lip of cervix that will get in the way. But there are options here. You might decide that you do want the midwife to have a check every so often, but you don't want to know how dilated, in case it sort of puts you off. And you can always change your mind at any time about what information you do or don't want. Or maybe you just say, right now I'm really in my zone and I'm really concentrating well, and can we wait 20 minutes to have the vaginal examination? So there are options there. So unless there's a medical indication, I'm not sure always that further vaginal examinations will really help sort of how long it will be before you meet your baby. There are other signs, so there's often a sort of purple line that appears over the sacral area. So as the baby's head moves down into the pelvis, it sort of pushes on veins and things, and this line appears, which is a good indication of how far the baby's head is moving down. Temperature of the legs apparently changes. There's all sorts of signs that midwives can look out for. So particularly in home births, independent midwives who are much more hands-off will tend to look for these things rather than necessarily doing lots of examinations. So there are a few things to think about. There's lots of information on places like aims.org.uk. There's also independent midwives or researcher midwives like Sarah Wickham, who writes extensively about all these sorts of decisions and options that you have.